In a neighborhood where quiet prejudice runs deep, 17-year-old Jordan Matthews finds himself isolated and judged for the color of his skin. But when he offers a helping hand to Walter Henderson, the reclusive old man next door, an unlikely bond begins to form. As their relationship deepens, both are forced to confront the uncomfortable truths about their pasts. However, with time running out for Walter, will they heal the wounds before it's too late? Or will their chance for redemption slip through their fingers? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Jordan Matthews stared out of the car window as the landscape of their new neighborhood rolled by. It was quiet here, with neatly trimmed lawns and rows of nearly identical houses standing like sentinels, guarding the street. The silence felt heavier than he expected, almost as if it were watching him. His mother, Melissa, sat beside him, her fingers gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. She offered him a tight smile. "This is it, Jordan. Our new beginning." Jordan nodded, though inside, he wasn't so sure. New beginnings were supposed to feel fresh and hopeful, but this one felt like an uphill climb. He was 17, in his final year of high school, and they had just uprooted their lives to move here. His mom had taken a job at a nearby hospital, which meant long hours and little time for herself, or for him. But they needed this change. They both did. The past few years had been rough, to say the least. The house they pulled up to was nice, though small compared to the others around it. It was one of those homes that felt like it had potential, waiting for someone to fill it with life again. Jordan could already picture the routine, helping his mom settle in, organizing his new room, and then the dread of starting at a new school, in a new town, where nobody knew him. And worse, nobody seemed like him. The neighborhood was predominantly white, and though he tried not to let it get to him, Jordan couldn't help but feel like an outsider before he even stepped out of the car. As they unloaded boxes, he noticed a few curious glances from across the street. A woman with a stroller slowed her pace as she passed, her eyes flicking toward him before she hurried on. Two men trimming hedges paused their conversation, casting brief, fleeting looks his way. It was subtle, nothing overt or aggressive, but it was enough to remind Jordan of the invisible wall that could rise between him and others, even before words were exchanged. "Come on, let's get inside," Melissa said, breaking his thoughts. Her voice was upbeat, but Jordan could sense the underlying strain. She had been through enough too. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes from the long shifts she worked at the hospital. Moving here was supposed to be a way for them to start fresh, but the burden of unspoken expectations and subtle stares was already weighing down on them. As they settled in, Jordan spent his first few days trying to keep a low profile. He helped unpack, explored the house, and tried to keep himself busy, but the walls felt like they were closing in on him. Melissa worked double shifts, leaving him alone for long stretches of time. Outside, the neighborhood was eerily still, as if everyone lived in their own quiet bubble. There was no welcome from the neighbors, no friendly introductions. Instead, there were glances, some curious, others cautious, but no one stepped forward. Except for Mr. Walter Henderson, the elderly man who lived next door. Jordan first noticed him when they were unpacking. Walter sat by his window, staring out as if the world outside had little to offer him anymore. He looked old, too old maybe, and tired. The kind of tired that went beyond physical exhaustion. Jordan figured he was just another lonely old man, but there was something in the way Walter looked out at the world that struck him. There was a coldness there, like the window was a barrier that had kept him shut off from everything. A few days later, Jordan found himself outside, killing time by kicking a ball against the fence, when he saw Walter again. This time, the old man was struggling to carry grocery bags from his car to his front door. The bags were heavy, and it was clear that each step was a challenge for him. For a moment, Jordan hesitated. He wasn't sure if Walter would appreciate the help. After all, he had seen the way people looked at him. Still, his mom had always told him to be kind, even when it wasn't easy. Taking a deep breath, Jordan jogged over. "Hey, need some help?" he asked, keeping his voice light. Walter turned, his face wrinkled in surprise. His eyes narrowed, not in recognition, but in suspicion. "I can manage," he said gruffly, though his arms were trembling from the weight of the bags. Jordan could have walked away, but something stopped him. "No offense, but it looks like those bags might be winning," he said with a small smile, reaching for one of them. For a moment Walter's grip tightened as if he might refuse, but then he let go, allowing Jordan to take the bag. They walked together to the front door in silence. Once inside, Walter gave a short nod, not exactly a thank you, but close enough. "I appreciate it," he muttered, his voice gruff but softer now. "No problem," Jordan replied. He waited a moment, expecting maybe a few more words, but Walter turned away, leaving Jordan standing awkwardly in the doorway. After a moment, Jordan turned and left, not sure what to make of the exchange. Over the next few days, the encounter stuck with him. There was something about Walter, something more than just the typical grumpy old man routine. Jordan didn't know what it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The neighborhood remained quiet, but the invisible weight of being an outsider pressed harder on Jordan's shoulders. At school, it was no better. The students were polite enough, but he felt their stares, the way conversations stopped when he walked by. He wasn't unfamiliar with this. He had felt it before, in different ways. But here, in this place that was supposed to be a fresh start, it stung a little more. Still, every time he passed by Walter's house, Jordan felt a pull. He didn't know why, but there was something about the old man that intrigued him. Maybe it was because Walter, like him, seemed isolated in a world that didn't quite know what to do with him. On a rainy afternoon, a few days after their first encounter, Jordan saw Walter struggling again, this time with his mail. The envelope slipping from his frail hands as the rain came down harder. Without thinking, Jordan ran over, offering to help once again. This time, Walter didn't protest as much. He gave a curt nod and let Jordan take the soggy letters from his hand. There was no conversation, just a brief, silent exchange, but it was enough to open the door, just a crack, to something more. And in that small, tentative beginning, Jordan realized that sometimes it only takes a single act of kindness to begin bridging a divide that seemed too wide to cross. Jordan didn't expect much to come from his brief interactions with Walter. The man was as distant as ever, and each encounter was laced with an awkward tension, as though both of them were standing on either side of an invisible line neither knew how to cross. Still, something kept pulling Jordan back to Walter's door, like an unspoken understanding between them. A shared, if unacknowledged, sense of isolation. In the days that followed, Jordan continued to go about his routine, but Walter was always there, lingering in the back of his mind. Each morning, Jordan would catch glimpses of the old man sitting at his window, gazing out as though waiting for something that never came. It wasn't pity that Jordan felt for Walter. It was something more complex. It was as though he could see the weight that time had pressed upon the man. The way loneliness had seeped into the cracks of his life and hardened into something unyielding. One afternoon, after another long, lonely day at school, Jordan found himself walking past Walter's house again. This time he saw the old man outside, standing by the garden that had clearly been neglected for years. The once vibrant flowers were overrun with weeds, and the dirt beds had long since been left untended. Walter stood there, staring at the overgrown patch of land with an expression that was difficult to read. It was a mix of longing and resignation, like he was looking at something he knew he could never restore. Without thinking, Jordan crossed the street and walked up to him. "Hey, Mr. Henderson," Jordan said, keeping his tone casual. Walter didn't look up right away. When he did, his face was as impassive as ever, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe. "What do you want?" Walter asked, though there was no bite to his words. Jordan shrugged, glancing at the garden. "I thought maybe you could use some help with this," he said, nodding toward the overgrown plot of land. "It looks like it used to be pretty nice." Walter let out a soft grunt, his eyes narrowing as if Jordan had struck a nerve. "That was my wife's garden," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I haven't touched it since she passed." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with the kind of sadness that doesn't need to be explained. Jordan shifted his weight, unsure of what to say. He had never lost anyone that close to him, but he understood grief in other ways, how it could make you retreat into yourself, how it could turn even the simplest tasks into insurmountable obstacles. "I'm sorry," Jordan said softly. It was all he could think to say. Walter didn't respond right away. He just stared at the garden, his jaw tight. "She loved this garden," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't yet allowed himself to feel. "I've let it go. Too much time has passed now. I don't have the strength to fix it." Jordan hesitated, not wanting to overstep, but something in him felt compelled to offer more. "I could help," he said. "I mean, I don't know much about gardening, but I could learn. We could get it back to how it was, for her." Walter's eyes flicked toward Jordan, his expression hard to read. There was a long silence before the old man let out a slow breath. "Why do you keep offering to help me?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Jordan thought about it for a moment. He didn't have a simple answer, but there was something about Walter that resonated with him, something about the way the old man had withdrawn from the world that felt all too familiar. Jordan knew what it was like to feel like you didn't quite belong, to feel like you were standing on the outside looking in. "I don't know," Jordan said honestly. "I guess I just think you could use a hand, and maybe I could too." Walter looked at him for a long moment, his sharp blue eyes scanning Jordan's face as though searching for something. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he turned back to the garden. "All right," he muttered. "If you want to help, I won't stop you. But don't expect me to get down on my knees and start pulling weeds. I'm too old for that." Jordan smiled, feeling a small victory in the exchange. "Deal," he said. Over the next few days, Jordan returned to Walter's house after school, determined to make good on his offer. He spent hours pulling weeds, tilling the soil, and slowly bringing the neglected garden back to life. At first, Walter just watched from his porch, offering the occasional gruff comment or instruction, but he kept his distance, as though unsure how much to invest in this new arrangement. But as the garden began to take shape, something else began to change too. Walter, though still guarded, started to open up. At first, it was small things, a comment about the weather, a passing remark about how the garden used to look. But gradually, the conversations grew longer, and Walter's stiff demeanor began to thaw. One evening, as the sun was setting and Jordan was wiping the dirt from his hands, Walter spoke up again, this time more reflectively. "I used to teach," he said, his eyes focused on the horizon. "Taught history at the high school for over 30 years, retired when my wife got sick." Jordan looked up, surprised. "Really? I didn't know that. Do you miss it?" Walter shrugged, his shoulders sagging under the weight of memories. "Sometimes, but after she passed, I didn't see much point in going back to anything. I kept thinking about how much time I wasted, time I could have spent with her." He paused, his voice thickening again. "You think you've got all the time in the world, but then it's gone." Jordan didn't know what to say. He had heard people talk about regret before, but hearing it from Walter, seeing the way it clung to him like a shadow, made it feel more real. Jordan thought about his own life, about the times he had let opportunities slip by because he was too scared or too uncertain to take them. "I think you're doing all right now," Jordan offered, glancing at the garden. "This place looks a lot better already." Walter chuckled softly, the sound catching Jordan off guard. It was the first time he had ever heard the old man laugh. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it's not too late to fix a few things." That night, as Jordan walked home, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Not just from the work he had done in the garden, but from the small but significant breakthrough he had made with Walter. He hadn't realized how much he needed this connection, how much it helped to have someone to talk to, even if that someone was a grumpy old man set in his ways. As the days turned into weeks, Jordan and Walter continued their routine. They worked together on the garden, shared stories, and slowly, the ice between them began to melt. Walter talked more about his life, about the joys and the regrets, about the way the world had changed and how he wasn't sure if he could keep up. And in return, Jordan began to open up too. He told Walter about his experiences at school, about the way people looked at him differently, as though they expected him to mess up. He talked about how hard it was to prove himself when the assumptions were already stacked against him. Walter, who had lived most of his life without questioning the world around him, listened with an attentiveness that surprised even himself. "You've got a lot more patience than I ever did," Walter said one afternoon, after Jordan had recounted another frustrating day at school. "I don't think I could have handled it the way you do." Jordan shrugged. "It's not easy, but what choice do I have? I just try to keep my head up and focus on what I can control." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's something," he said quietly, "more than a lot of people can say." And just like that, the foundation of a friendship began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when Walter's old prejudices slipped through, but Jordan was patient. He could see that Walter was trying to understand, trying to change. And that was more than he could have asked for. In the quiet moments between them, as they worked side by side in the garden, Jordan realized that maybe, just maybe, they were both helping each other grow in ways neither of them had expected. The steady rhythm of their newfound routine gave Jordan a sense of stability, something he hadn't realized he needed so badly. Working on the garden with Walter became more than just a task. It was a kind of sanctuary, a space where the world's silent judgments faded into the background. In those hours, the worries that usually gnawed at Jordan, about school, about being an outsider in his neighborhood, about the stairs, seemed to lose their power. But outside of that space, reality was still waiting. At school, the subtle forms of prejudice Jordan faced only seemed to intensify. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Teachers greeted him with forced politeness, and students offered small talk in passing. But there was always an undercurrent. He'd overhear whispers behind his back in the hallway or notice how classmates would shift uncomfortably when he walked into a room. People were careful, always just shy of outright hostility, but the message was clear: he didn't belong. One particular day, that quiet tension finally boiled over. Jordan had always tried to stay out of trouble, to keep his head down, but trouble had a way of finding him. It started with something small, a teacher asking him to stay after class to discuss misunderstanding about a missing book. The accusation was vague, but the implication was clear enough. Jordan had been the last one to borrow the book from the library, and now it was missing. "I didn't take it," Jordan said calmly, though he could feel his pulse quicken. He had been here before. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed the worst about him. "I turned it in last week." The teacher, a middle-aged woman with a kind but distant demeanor, frowned as if weighing his words. "We just want to get to the bottom of this," she said, her voice clipped. "If you could check your locker one more time, just to be sure." Jordan's stomach twisted. The unspoken suspicion in her tone hit him like a weight pressing down on his chest. He knew there was no missing book in his locker, but it didn't matter. The doubt was already there. And it wasn't just about the book. It was about who they thought he was, what they saw when they looked at him. A young black man who must have made a mistake, who must have done something wrong. He checked his locker, as asked, feeling the eyes of his classmates on him. The metal door creaked open to reveal exactly what he expected. No book. But the damage was done. The teacher apologized and excused him from further questioning, but the looks from his peers, the whispered jokes as he walked by, stayed with him for the rest of the day. By the time Jordan got home, the weight of it all was suffocating. His mother, Melissa, was working a double shift again, so the house was empty. Normally he would have tried to distract himself, maybe bury his head in a book, or lose himself in music, but today, the anger simmered too close to the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling of being judged, of always being one wrong move away from fitting the stereotype people expected of him. It wasn't fair. But that didn't seem to matter. Needing an outlet, he found himself walking next door to Walter's house. The old man was in the backyard, sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the garden they had worked so hard to revive. The sight of it, now blooming with fresh flowers and vibrant greenery, offered a momentary sense of calm. But it wasn't enough to chase away the anger roiling inside him. "Rough day?" Walter asked, glancing up as Jordan approached. Jordan sat down heavily on the porch steps, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah," he muttered, staring at the garden. "Something like that." Walter studied him for a moment, his weathered face creased in thought. "You don't look like yourself today," he said after a pause. Want to talk about it? For a second, Jordan hesitated. He wasn't sure how much he wanted to share. He had never really talked about these things with anyone before, not even his mom. But something about the way Walter asked, the quiet sincerity in his voice, made him open up. It's just, I don't get it, Jordan said, frustration bleeding into his voice. I didn't do anything wrong, but it feels like no matter what I do, people are always looking for a reason to doubt me. Like today, at school, they thought I stole something, just because I was the last one to borrow it. And yeah, they let it go when they didn't find anything, but that doesn't change the fact that they assumed I was the one who did it. Walter didn't respond right away, letting Jordan's words hang in the air. His sharp blue eyes were thoughtful, and for once, he didn't seem to have an easy answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply, his expression unreadable. I don't know what to say, Walter said finally, his voice quieter than usual. I never had to deal with that. I've lived my whole life in a world that didn't look at me the way it looks at you. But I do know this. It ain't fair. It's not right. Jordan was taken aback by the admission. He had expected Walter to offer some platitude or dismiss his concerns like so many others had done before. But instead, Walter seemed genuinely at a loss, grappling with the reality of something he had never fully understood. You know, Walter continued, his voice slow and deliberate, I've spent a lot of years thinking I knew how the world worked. Thinking that people just needed to pull themselves up, do the right thing, and everything would work out. But the truth is, I didn't know half of what I thought I did. Jordan frowned, not sure where Walter was going with this. What do you mean? I mean, I was blind to a lot of things, Walter admitted, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I thought I understood people, but I only ever saw things through my own eyes. Never stopped to think about how other folks might be living, what they were going through. I've heard stories about kids like you, seen things on the news, but it never hit me until now, until I got to know you, that maybe I've been part of the problem too. Jordan wasn't sure what to say. Hearing Walter acknowledge his own complicity in the biases that shaped their world was both surprising and strangely comforting. It wasn't a solution, but it felt like a step in the right direction, a step toward understanding. You're not like most people I know, Walter added, his voice softer now. You've got a strength in you, a patience I don't think I ever had. It takes a lot to keep going when the world's stacked against you. Jordan shrugged, not sure how to respond. It's not like I have a choice, he said quietly. I just try to keep my head down and not let it get to me. Walter nodded slowly. Well, maybe you shouldn't have to keep your head down. Maybe it's time people start looking up. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are trying to understand something bigger than themselves. In that moment, Jordan realized that Walter wasn't just talking about him anymore. He was talking about both of them, about how the world had shaped them in different ways, and how, in their own small corner of the world, they were starting to bridge the divide. I guess I just get tired of it, Jordan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Tired of always having to prove myself, of being seen as something I'm not. Walter let out a slow breath, his gaze thoughtful. I can't pretend to know what that feels like, he said quietly. But I do know this. You're a good kid, Jordan. And if the world can't see that, then the world's got more to fix than you do. The words hit Jordan harder than he expected. He wasn't used to hearing people stand up for him, especially not someone like Walter. It was a small thing, but in that moment it meant everything. Thanks, Jordan said, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't sure how to express. Walter nodded, his expression softening. We've all got a lot to learn, kid, he said, his voice low. Maybe I've learned more from you in these past few weeks than I did in all my years as a teacher. For the first time since he had met Walter, Jordan saw something shift in the old man's eyes. It wasn't just empathy or understanding, it was a kind of quiet respect, a recognition of the struggles Jordan had faced and the strength it took to keep moving forward. As they sat there, side by side, watching the garden they had revived together, Jordan realized something. This unlikely friendship, this connection between him and Walter, wasn't just helping Walter. It was helping him too. In a world that often felt hostile and unwelcoming, he had found a small place of belonging, a place where he didn't have to prove anything, where he could just be himself. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The days began to blur together in the comforting rhythm of Jordan's visits to Walter's house. The once neglected garden had flourished under their care, its colors and vitality contrasting sharply with the lingering sense of isolation that still hung over the neighborhood. Yet, despite the beauty they had cultivated in Walter's yard, the world beyond the fence hadn't changed nearly as much. Jordan's friendship with Walter was a source of strength for him. It gave him something to look forward to after the challenges he faced at school. And it was during those quiet afternoons in the garden that he found the patience to deal with the unspoken prejudice around him. But the burden of that prejudice never really went away. It was always there, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day at school, Jordan made his way to Walter's house. He hadn't said much when he arrived, just nodded at Walter and set about his usual routine in the garden. But Walter, ever observant, didn't let Jordan's silence go unnoticed. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders today," Walter remarked, his voice carrying that familiar blend of gruffness and concern. He sat on the porch with his iced tea, watching Jordan pull weeds. Jordan wiped his brow and shrugged, not wanting to get into it. "It's nothing," he said, though his tone betrayed him. Walter didn't push, but he didn't let it drop either. "You've been working hard, kid. Maybe harder than anyone should have to at your age." Jordan stopped what he was doing and sighed, leaning on his shovel. "It's just, some days it feels like no matter what I do, people will always see me as different, as less." His voice was quiet, the frustration seeping through every word. "I don't know how to change that." Walter nodded slowly, as if considering his response. "That's the hard part, isn't it?" he said, his gaze distant. "People get stuck in their ways, stuck in their ideas about the world. It's hard to make them see things differently, especially when they don't even realize they're doing it." There was a pause, a weighty silence that settled between them as Jordan absorbed Walter's words. He had heard similar sentiments before. People talking about how change was slow, how you couldn't expect the world to transform overnight. But it felt different coming from Walter. Here was a man who had lived his whole life in the same bubble, surrounded by the same beliefs and biases, and yet he was changing. Slowly, yes, but changing all the same. "Do you think people can really change?" Jordan asked after a moment, his voice hesitant. "I mean, for good?" Walter looked at him, his eyes sharp but softened by something that hadn't been there before. "I think people can change," he said, his voice steady. "But not everyone's willing to do the work it takes. Change isn't easy, Jordan. It's uncomfortable. It makes you face things about yourself that you might not like." Jordan nodded, thinking back to the way some of his classmates treated him, the way his teachers seemed to always doubt him, the subtle, silent judgments that followed him, no matter how hard he tried to prove himself. "It's just hard," he said quietly. "I feel like I'm constantly being tested, like I have to be better than everyone else just to get the same respect." Walter sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's because you're fighting against something bigger than you. People's ideas, their prejudices, they're built up over a lifetime. You can't tear them down overnight. But that doesn't mean you stop trying." Jordan looked up at him, sincerity in Walter's voice. The man who had once seemed so stuck in his own ways, so closed off to the world, was now speaking about change as though it were something he understood on a personal level. And maybe he did. "Have you ever felt like that?" Jordan asked. "Like you had to change?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were confessing something he hadn't wanted to admit. "Yeah," he said softly. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. The way I used to be, the way I used to think about things. I didn't realize how blind I was. I spent most of my life convinced that I knew the way the world worked, but I was only seeing it from one angle. It wasn't until I met you that I started to see things differently." Jordan was taken aback by the honesty in Walter's words. He hadn't expected the old man to admit something like that so openly. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, one that Jordan hadn't seen in Walter before. "You changed too," Walter continued, his voice thoughtful. "You made me see that it's never too late to learn. Never too late to open your eyes to the things you've been ignoring." Jordan didn't know what to say. It was strange hearing Walter talk like this, as though their friendship had shifted something fundamental in both of them. But before he could respond, a voice interrupted their conversation. "Hey, Jordan." Jordan turned to see one of the neighbors, Mr. Thompson, walking toward the fence with a friendly but cautious smile. He was a middle-aged man, usually friendly enough, but Jordan could sense the same undertone of discomfort that seemed to characterize most of his interactions with the people in the neighborhood. "Afternoon, Mr. Thompson," Jordan said, forcing a polite smile. Mr. Thompson glanced at the garden, then back at Jordan. "You've done a great job with Mr. Henderson's place here," he said. "It looks like a completely different yard." Jordan nodded. "Thanks. We've both been working on it." There was a brief pause before Mr. Thompson continued, his tone shifting slightly. "You know, some of the neighbors have been talking," he said, his voice lowering as though he were about to share a secret. "They're curious about what you're doing over here so much. They've noticed how close you and Mr. Henderson have gotten." Jordan frowned, not sure what Mr. Thompson was getting at. "Yeah, we've become friends," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Mr. Thompson's smile tightened. "Well, that's good. I just, some people around here, they might not understand it. People talk." Jordan's stomach clenched, but he kept his expression calm. "What do you mean?" "Ah, nothing to worry about," Mr. Thompson said, waving it off with a chuckle. "You know how people can be, set in their ways, slow to accept change. But don't let it get to you. You're doing a good thing here." With that, Mr. Thompson nodded and walked off, leaving Jordan standing there with a bitter taste in his mouth. People talk. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a reminder that no matter how hard Jordan worked to break down the barriers between him and the people in this neighborhood, there would always be those who couldn't, or wouldn't, see beyond their own assumptions. "Don't listen to him," Walter said after a moment, his voice gruff. "People like that, they don't matter." Jordan shook his head, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "But they do matter," he said. "They're the ones who keep making this harder than it needs to be. They're the ones who don't want to see things change." Walter sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he said quietly, "but you can't carry the weight of everyone else's ignorance. That's not your burden." Jordan didn't respond right away. He appreciated what Walter was trying to say, but the truth was, it did feel like his burden. Every day, he had to navigate a world that judged him before he even opened his mouth. A world that expected him to prove himself over and over again. And even when he did, even when he went out of his way to be kind, to work hard, to be better, it still wasn't enough for some people. "How do you change that?" Jordan asked quietly, more to himself than to Walter. Walter leaned forward in his chair, his voice gentle but firm. "You keep doing what you're doing," he said. "You keep showing people who you really are. And maybe, just maybe, they'll start to see the truth. And if they don't, well, that's their loss, not yours." Jordan looked at Walter, surprised by the conviction in his words. It was strange to think that this man, who had once been so closed off, so set in his ways, was now offering him advice on how to handle prejudice and ignorance. But that was the thing about change. It could come from the most unexpected places. "Thanks," Jordan said softly. Walter nodded, his gaze fixed on the garden. "You've helped me see things differently, kid," he said after a long pause. "Maybe I can help you do the same for others." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden they had brought back to life, Jordan felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in a world where change was slow and hard-earned, sometimes that was all you needed to keep going. But the challenges weren't over. Walter's health was beginning to decline, and Jordan could see it. The old man moved slower, coughed more often, and sometimes had to sit down after just a few minutes of work in the garden. It was a quiet reminder that time was slipping away, that this fragile friendship they had built was on borrowed time. And yet, despite the looming sense of loss, Jordan felt a strange sense of peace. Walter had changed. He had opened his heart and mind in ways Jordan hadn't expected. And if that kind of transformation was possible in someone like Walter, maybe it was possible for the rest of the world too. Maybe. As autumn began to settle into the air, the once vibrant garden that Jordan and Walter had nurtured started to change. The flowers wilted, and the leaves turned shades of gold and red, mirroring the slow but inevitable passage of time. For Jordan, the season's shift felt symbolic of the changes happening in his life, and even more so in Walter's. Walter had been spending more time resting, his energy waning day by day. Jordan noticed the subtle signs, the slower movements, the labored breathing, but neither of them spoke about it. They both knew that their time together was growing shorter, yet neither was ready to face the reality. One crisp afternoon, Jordan arrived at Walter's house to find him not on the porch, but inside, sitting by the window with an old photo album on his lap. The house was quiet, the air thick with a certain kind of stillness that Jordan hadn't felt before. Walter looked up as he entered, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "Come in, kid," Walter said, his voice a little weaker than usual. "I was just looking through some old memories." Jordan nodded and took a seat across from him, noticing the old yellowing photographs that lay scattered across Walter's lap. The photos were faded, capturing moments from a life lived long ago. A young Walter, smiling with his wife at what looked like a picnic. Another of him as a younger man, standing proudly in front of a classroom full of students. The years had softened the edges of the pictures, but the emotions in them were still clear. "You ever wonder where all the time goes?" Walter asked suddenly, his eyes distant as he looked at the photographs. "One minute you're young, with your whole life ahead of you, and the next, well, you're looking back, wondering how it all slipped through your fingers." Jordan didn't know what to say. He could see the weight of regret hanging over Walter, but it wasn't just about the passage of time. It was about something deeper, something unresolved. "I think about that sometimes," Jordan admitted quietly. "I mean, I'm still young, but I wonder if I'll look back one day and regret the things I didn't do." Walter nodded, his eyes flicking to a particular photo of his wife, smiling in the sunshine. "That's the thing, Jordan. Regret isn't about what you did, it's about what you didn't do. The chances you didn't take, the people you didn't make things right with." There was a long pause before Walter continued, his voice softer now, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Jordan. "I haven't spoken to my kids in years," he said, his tone heavy with sadness. "Not since their mother died. I pushed them away. I was stubborn, angry, and now I don't even know how to reach out to them." Jordan felt a pang of sympathy. He had always wondered why Walter seemed so alone, why his family wasn't around. Now he had the answer. "Why don't you try?" Jordan asked gently. "It's not too late, Mr. Henderson. You can still fix things with them." Walter let out a long sigh, his eyes clouded with emotion. "I don't know if they'd want to hear from me. I've been out of their lives for so long. Maybe it's better this way." Jordan shook his head. "No, it's not. Trust me. They'd want to hear from you. I know if my dad were still alive, I'd want him to reach out, no matter what happened between us." Walter glanced up at Jordan, a look of surprise crossing his face. It was rare for Jordan to talk about his father, and it was the first time he had mentioned him to Walter. Jordan hadn't grown up with his father. He had left when Jordan was young, and though his mother had done everything to fill that gap, the absence was always there, lingering in the background of Jordan's life. "Your dad, huh?" Walter said softly. "What happened?" Jordan shrugged, trying to keep his voice steady. "He left when I was little, just walked out one day and never came back. I haven't seen him since." Walter's eyes softened with understanding. "That must have been hard." "Yeah, it was," Jordan admitted. "But I learned to live with it. Still, I always wondered, if he ever wanted to reach out, if he ever thought about me. And I think that's how your kids probably feel. They're waiting for you to reach out, even if they don't say it." Walter was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph in his lap. Jordan could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. The fear of rejection, the regret of lost time, and the desire to make amends before it was too late. "You think I should?" Walter asked finally, his voice small, almost like he was asking for permission. "I think you have to," Jordan said firmly. "You'll never forgive yourself if you don't try." Walter sat in silence for a while, staring out the window at the garden they had worked so hard to bring back to life. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and for a moment Jordan wasn't sure if Walter would actually take the step he so desperately needed to take. But then, slowly, Walter nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't let it end like this." The next day, with Jordan's encouragement, Walter picked up the phone. It was one of the most difficult things he had done in years, his hands trembling as he dialed the number he hadn't called in what felt like a lifetime. Jordan stayed by his side, offering quiet support as Walter waited for the line to connect. When it finally did, the sound of his daughter's voice on the other end was like a lifeline, a voice that was both familiar and distant, filled with surprise and emotion. "Dad?" she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Is that really you?" Walter swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's been a long time, but I wanted to see how you were. I wanted to say I'm sorry." There was a pause, a long moment of silence that stretched between them, and for a second, Jordan thought the call might end in heartbreak. But then, to his relief, Walter's daughter spoke again. This time, softer, more forgiving. "I've missed you," she said, her voice breaking. "We've all missed you, Dad." The relief on Walter's face was palpable. His shoulders sagged with the weight of the years he had spent in silence, and for the first time since Jordan had known him, Walter looked truly vulnerable. Tears welled up in his eyes and he wiped them away quickly, trying to maintain his composure. "I've missed you too," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've missed all of you." The conversation continued, halting and emotional, as Walter and his daughter began the long process of mending what had been broken. They talked about the years they had lost, the regrets they both carried, and the hope of moving forward. By the time Walter hung up the phone, his hands were still shaking, but there was a new light in his eyes, a light that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," Walter said to Jordan, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't have done that without you." Jordan smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I'm glad you did. You deserve to have your family back." In the weeks that followed, Walter's children visited. His once quiet home became filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the clattering of dishes as they gathered around the kitchen table, reminiscing about the past and making plans for the future. Jordan watched from the sidelines, happy to see the family slowly piecing itself back together. But even as Walter reconnected with his children, his health continued to decline. The visits became more frequent, and the laughter was often punctuated by concerned glances as Walter's strength faded. Jordan stayed by his side, helping out where he could, but it was clear to both of them that their time together was running out. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter called Jordan over to the porch. His voice was weaker now, but there was a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before. "I just wanted to say, thank you," Walter said softly, his hand resting on Jordan's shoulder. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever get back." Jordan swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Henderson. You did all the hard work." Walter chuckled weakly. "Maybe so, but you were the one who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." There was a long pause as they sat together in the fading light, the garden around them, quiet and still. The vibrant flowers they had planted together were starting to wilt with the changing season. But to Jordan, they still held the beauty of something that had been restored, even if only for a time. "I'm proud of you, Jordan," Walter said after a long silence. "You've got a good heart. Don't ever let this world take that away from you." Jordan looked at the old man beside him, his mentor, his friend, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I won't," he promised. Walter smiled, a tired but content smile, and leaned back in his chair. "Good. Now, I think it's time I rest." In the days that followed, Walter's condition worsened, and one quiet morning, he passed away peacefully, surrounded by his children and Jordan, the young man who had become like family to him. The neighborhood that had once been marked by silence and prejudice felt different now. People had seen the change in Walter, had seen him open his heart and mind in his final days, and slowly, the ripple effect of his transformation began to spread. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening out in the open. And though change was slow, it was there. At Walter's funeral, Jordan stood with his mother and Walter's family, feeling the loss deeply, but also recognizing the profound impact the old man had had on his life. Walter had shown him that change, though difficult, was possible, that people could learn, grow, and heal, even after a lifetime of mistakes. In the weeks after the funeral, Jordan continued to tend to Walter's garden, keeping it alive as a tribute to the man who had taught him so much. One evening, as he stood in the now vibrant garden, looking out at the world that had once seemed so cold, Jordan felt a sense of peace. He had helped bridge a divide that had once seemed impossible to cross, and in doing so, he had found his own place in a world that had often felt unwelcoming. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, casting its warm light over the garden, Jordan knew that, despite the challenges ahead, he had made a difference, not just in Walter's life, but in his own. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.